Greetings. The date is August 10th, 2015. It has been 1 week since my inaugural episode of Adventures in Speed Reading, where I am trying to take this pile of DC Comics graphic novels and read as many as I can in a week, and then kind of give you guys a sort of vlog-ish update once a week on how I did for the previous week. And this was a Vertigo kind of week for me. I read almost entirely Vertigo stories, or at least stories involving characters who are known for their work in the Vertigo universe. First, I read Madame Xanadu, Disenchanted. This collects the first 10 issues of the Matt Wagner, Amy Reeder Hadley, Madame Xanadu series. Then I read an original illustrated prose, is what I would call it, story. This is Sandman, the Dream Hunters. It is by Neil Gaiman and Yoshitaka Amano. This is the same artist who did Elektra, Wolverine, the Redeemer, and it's done very similar to that story. It's more illustrated prose and less of a graphic novel, but it was on the pile, and it is done by Vertigo, so I'm counting it. And then I read Animal Man, The Meaning of Flesh. This is volume 5 in the series of Animal Man Vertigo graphic novels, if you're keeping up with those. And this is most of Tom Veitch's run, with the artist being Steve Dillon on almost every issue in that book. And then I read a couple of Hellblazer books. The first one was John Constantine, Hellblazer, The Devil You Know. This is the second trade in the series, although they more recently did an up-to-date version of this trade that has a different cover. But I've had this one for like 5 years now, so it has an older cover, but it's essentially the same material as the newer version of that trade. And then also John Constantine, Hellblazer, Fear and Loathing. This is from Garth Ennis and again Steve Dillon, whose name was just popped up in the Animal Man run. And this is not a trade that has a modern equivalent. In the more up-to-date version of these trades, none of those trades has the name Fear and Loathing. So I think what they did, one of the more recent trades has a different name and includes all of these issues plus probably a few more. But I have this that I got at a yard sale forever and a day ago, so this is also an older trade, but I don't have the newer version. And then lastly, I read The Last Days of Animal Man. This is by Jerry Conway, Chris Batista, and Dave Micus. So right off the bat, I want to go ahead and say that I am going to be doing more up-to-date, more involved reviews on Madame Xanadu and Animal Man, The Meaning of Flesh. You can look for those videos later this week, but I am going to, because a couple of people in the comments of my last week's video, a couple of people were saying, hey, maybe you could talk a little bit about each of the books that you read during that week. Since I had some people ask that I do that, I am going to try and do very quick little should you read this, yes or no reviews for these, but for a couple of them, I have so many thoughts that I want to get out there that I also want to do a bigger, longer video. So starting with Madame Xanadu, the first book that I read. Basically, if you like a story that is set in different points in history, but also shows the hidden history that you've never heard or seen before, in this case, it's the history of the real world. It shows stuff like when Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, when Kublai Khan was in charge of China, and Marco Polo went to China. That's a real event in history. But then it's also got stuff like Zatara and the birth of the Spectra, all that happening in the late 30s, early 40s, and then the fall of Camelot. That's, of course, a very fictional event. But all of these events throughout different points in history, the character of Madame Xanadu is present throughout all of those different events. And it's handled very creatively, very original stuff here. Of course, you've seen stories of immortal characters who are present at all of the major important pieces of history, but if that's handled well, it doesn't necessarily bother me. Sometimes it might not necessarily be handled very well, but in this case, I really liked it. And it really put me in a mood to read a lot more of the mystical, darker, edgier stuff from DC Comics. A lot of this stuff set in the Vertigo line of comics. And so it did do its job of kind of making me thirsty for more of this stuff. And I will be checking out more of the trades from this series. I'm very interested to see what is Matt Wagner and Amy Reeder Hadley going to be doing with the rest of this series, because it kind of sort of brings you up to almost the present day. So I'm curious, are they going to go back into different other points in history and kind of fill in some of the gaps, or is the rest of the series going to be set in the present day? And I think there's 4 or 5 other trades in this run. I think there may be 5 total. And so if you are interested in this series, the whole series is collected in trades, so that's good news for you, good news for me, and I was very interested after reading this, and I do recommend it, although I will say I have more things to say about it whenever I put up a video review of that book in full later in this week. And then up next we have Neil Gaiman and Yoshitaka Amano's Sandman: The Dream Hunters. Basically, this is a very well handled fairy tale story set in Japan, I believe. And basically, if you like those kind of Aesop's Fables kinds of stories, although in this case it's not really Aesop's Fables, it's a fable set around sort of the more Japanese leaning of mythology. If you like those kinds of stories, you're going to like this. In fact, Neil Gaiman even says that it's very loosely based on some existing Japanese mythology. Now, I had heard before I read this that that book that Neil Gaiman talks about in the afterword doesn't actually exist, and that he's just kind of pulling one over on the readers. I really have no idea, because I tried to look up that book and I couldn't find any information. So maybe that book doesn't even exist. Maybe everything in this book is all from the mind of Neil Gaiman. If so, then kudos to him for pulling one over on me. But this does feel like something that came right out of Japanese mythology, with the Sandman sprinkled in. The character of Dream from Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series. And if you haven't read The Sandman by Neil Gaiman, you will probably still enjoy this. You probably won't understand the importance of the character of Dream / Morpheus, who shows up here. You probably won't care too much about him, because he's really just a side character who kind of shows up at the end. You won't really understand the gravity of that character if you haven't read Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series. But if you have, this will be a nice little supplemental piece to that series. And it's been several years since I read Gaiman's The Sandman, but I did remember most of what happened in that run, and so this was a nice little revisit to that world. I didn't necessarily think I would enjoy going back to that world, because I kind of like to look at his 10-volume run on The Sandman as one giant unit of one story, and I didn't necessarily think you had to go back to do further visits to that world. I kind of felt like it might be cheap. It would kind of lessen the impact that that 10-volume run had. Not the case. I think this is worth going back to that world. And it doesn't necessarily even bring in a lot of the other characters from the Sandman. This is a couple of new characters who weren't part of that run, and Morpheus, who's kind of a side character. So I think if you are going to do revisits to that world, this is the way to do it. And I know that Gaiman has much more recently kind of done another return to the world of the Sandman. I have not read any of that. I don't know if it's any good, if it's as good or better than the original Sandman stuff. But I know that this was definitely worth reading if you are a fan of the original Sandman, and even if you're not, this is worth reading just on its own merits. I think it's that good. Up next, we have Animal Man: The Meaning of Flesh. This is really going to be one that I'm going to delve into in great detail when I do a video on it later in this week. But for now, I just want to say this is not very good. If you've read Grant Morrison's Animal Man run, this is not as good as his run. And I think the problem for me is that I'm comparing it to Grant Morrison's run, and that's really my problem. It's my baggage that I'm bringing to the book. Just in my humble opinion, Grant Morrison is the one person who really made Animal Man a character to read about. Before Grant Morrison came along, Animal Man existed as a character, but nobody really cared about him. And Grant Morrison changed that. He made him a character that people wanted to read about. And then after Grant Morrison left the series, you were followed by a series of different authors who all had to try and find their own angle on the character. And they all had the unenviable task of following Grant Morrison, who kind of dropped everyone's jaws and blew everyone's minds when he left the title. And I'm not going to talk about what he did on that series other than say Grant Morrison did a really terrific job of balancing two seemingly unbalanceable aspects of superhero comics with the character of Animal Man. He has Buddy Baker. He is a family man. He has family problems, but ultimately, at the end of the day, his family comes first, and his family stuff isn't so dramatic and so heavy that it feels like he's losing his family. And at the same time, you've also got superhero stuff going on. You have weird mystical superhero stuff going on in Grant Morrison's run, and that continues through Peter Milligan's brief run, and on up until Tom Veitch's run. And I think the problem that I have here, and this is something I'm going to come back to when we talk about the last days of Animal Man, but it seems like everyone else who has followed Grant Morrison on Animal Man, and I haven't read any of Jamie Delano's run, that's what comes after Tom Veitch's run, but I haven't read any of Delano's run, but it seems like everyone who has followed Grant Morrison gets that balance out of whack. And I should say, it's not absolutely necessary that you do follow what Grant Morrison did, that you do exactly what he did, that you take the formula that he had with the character and you use that formula. You don't have to do that. You can make the character your own. The problem is, you run the risk of kind of making the character feel almost unrecognizable. In the case of Tom Veitch's run, I feel like he takes the family stuff and he makes it way too melodramatic, and it just becomes very awkward reading about Buddy having problems with his wife, and he's almost sort of cheating on his wife. He's making out with this shaman woman, and his son runs away from Buddy because Buddy hits him, and then his daughter is increasingly becoming more and more annoying, and she was never really annoying before this, I didn't feel, but she's got Buddy's animal powers, and that's kind of another anvil around his family life, and basically his family drama, it just feels way too heavy, way too angsty and melodramatic here, and much as Buddy had problems in the Grant Morrison run, he had family problems, but at the end of the day, his family stuff was fairly lighthearted. He was a family man, and I don't ever feel like he had too much family problems going on. Whereas here in this Tom Veitch run, in The Meaning of Flesh, I feel like his family problems are becoming too deep and too heavy, if that makes any sense. Meanwhile, the superhero stuff in this run is just becoming really weird, and I feel like it kind of got out of Veich's control. I feel like he had some ideas, and he started running with those ideas, and then he couldn't get them to stop. So he has several dropped plot points here that don't ever get resolved in this run. Maybe Jamie Delano picks up with them in volumes 6 and 7, I don't know, but in this book, there's a few things that are kind of introduced and then nothing ever happens with them. Cliff is sort of abducted by his creepy uncle. We don't ever get to see what happens there. Also, Cliff's mom, Buddy's wife, Ellen, she goes to work for a comic book company because she's an artist, and her co-worker who writes these comic books for a character called the Penalizer, and he's basically like a more gruesome, more crazy, insane version of the Punisher. Basically, he becomes the Penalizer. He has this Penalizer costume, and he has a gun, and he has a trench coat, and it's like, oh, okay, this is going to be interesting. This guy who has lost all grip on reality, and he's going to go, and he's going to do all this stuff. That doesn't ever go anywhere. We see him put on this Penalizer costume, and then nothing happens. All of this stuff, there's at least 3 or 4 more dropped plot lines that I feel like Veidt wanted to do something with them, but then he leaves the book in issue 50, and that's the last issue collected here, and I feel like his run just kind of fizzles out. There's, at one point, Wannabeast. He's another character with animal powers. He shows up out of nowhere, possessed by this evil demon, and then I don't really understand the severity of that, because this character, he just shows up out of nowhere possessed. If this had been built up a little bit, if Wannabeast had been part of this run for several issues, and then he becomes possessed by this evil entity, it would have felt more important. It would have felt like it mattered a little bit more. As is, there's another plot point here. This guy who runs one of the branches of Star Labs, he's trying to give himself animal powers, and he's kind of a bad guy, but ultimately, I feel like that whole story doesn't really go anywhere. He's just kind of taking up a lot of page space here. There's entire issues in this run that could have been taken out, and the entire crux of this run could have been more focused into another direction if you had just taken out all that Star Labs stuff. Ultimately, I don't think I can recommend Tom Veich's run on Animal Man. I don't think that it's something that you should read. There's really nothing here worth reading. It's not as good as Grant Morrison's run, and if you're afraid that they're not going to keep collecting these Animal Man trades if you don't go ahead and put your money towards one of these collections, well, you don't have to worry about that because they're collecting the entire Animal Man run. In fact, I think Jamie Delano's run is already out in 2 trades, so you don't even have to worry about feeling obligated to buy it just because you're a fan of Animal Man the character. Ultimately, I cannot recommend Animal Man: The Meaning of Flesh, but I am planning on getting Volume 6, the beginning of Delano's run, because I have high hopes that Delano can take the character and do something with the character, and that he hasn't already been derailed under the run of Tom Veidt, I hope. Up next, there are a couple of Hellblazer trades, and I'm not going to talk much about these two books here. Basically, I didn't really enjoy these. They were written okay, but I didn't really enjoy them. I find that I'm not really a huge fan of the character of Constantine, which is weird because I have 3 trades of Constantine, but I think the reason that I bought the first 2 trades, Original Sins, which I read years ago, and this trade right here, the reason that I bought these 2 trades was because I did like the character of Constantine when he was in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run. I liked Constantine as Swamp Thing's Merlin. He's the guy who introduces Swamp Thing to this larger world that he's not aware of, and he's just kind of a side character showing him all this stuff that he didn't know about. I liked Constantine when that was the role that he played. And then apparently what happened, everyone just fell in love with his character, and so someone at DC Comics said, let's give him his own series. And in my opinion, he doesn't work as well as his own lead. Apparently, I'm the only person in the universe who feels that way because he had like 300-something issues of his own Vertigo run before that series was canceled, and then he almost immediately got his own New 52 series called Constantine. So he's had his own series for the better part of 35 years or something like that. Maybe not quite that long, but he's been around for a while as a solo character. But I didn't really care for this first one, The Devil You Know, or yeah, The Devil You Know. For some reason, I thought it was The Devil in the Details. That's probably something else entirely. This is picking up with a lot of plot lines from the Swamp Thing comics that were coming out around the same time, as well as the first Constantine trade. So if you haven't read any of that stuff, and you just picked up with this like I did, and you haven't read Swamp Thing or Constantine for over 5 years, then you would probably be really confused at first. Although, after a couple of issues, the book kind of catches you up to speed, and after a couple of issues you get caught up and you're not confused anymore. And then it's just a whole lot of Constantine and getting to know him and kind of getting a feel for what his series is going to be giving you over the course of its run. Because for the first like 10 issues of his series, it was sort of this very lengthy storyline that was getting Constantine out of the shadow of Swamp Thing and kind of getting him out of being just a spin-off character and kind of turning him into his own character. And after it does that, I feel like that's kind of when this book loses me, because for the first 10 issues or so of this series, it's a pretty good story where these demons are trying to get someone elected in Great Britain, and then there's this one particular demon who has a connection to Constantine from his youth. All of that stuff was really great. And then there's this annual story, which has almost nothing to do with Constantine. It's about, I guess, one of his ancestors who ruled Britain back in the 500s. I didn't really care for that story. And then there's this other 2 issues from a series called The Horrorist, and if anything, those feel even more rated R than anything else from the Vertigo stuff that I read here. They feel very edgy, very adult, more than anything else here, even more than this storyline, which was happening during the series actually being part of the Vertigo line. Because a lot of these books that I'm showing you, like The Animal Man: The Meaning of Flesh, and this Constantine book, they predated Vertigo actually being a line. They kind of sowed the seeds for Vertigo existing. They were edgier than anything else going on at DC, but Vertigo didn't exist at that time, so these books were not part of the Vertigo line. But these 2 issues of The Horrorist, they feel very Vertigo. They feel very edgy, very adult, very rated R. And I didn't really like this book. It was a little too grim and gritty, a little too dark and bleak for my taste. I want things to be a little closer to the Skittles and Rainbow side of things. And I'm not saying that everything has to be happy-go-lucky all the time when I'm reading comic books, but I do feel like this went a little too close to the dark side of things. And I'm, again, probably the only person in the universe who feels that way, because I know there are a ton of people who are huge Constantine fans. I just feel like I'm not one of them. I would be just fine if he only ever was a spin-off character who, or not a spin-off character, but a side character who existed in the Swamp Thing world and didn't really come out and be in his own series. That's just my opinion. And then you had this story, Fear and Loathing, which I was kind of confused reading this. There's a lot of stuff going on here that I didn't really understand. Basically, Constantine has this girlfriend who doesn't tolerate his magical leanings, and then his magic doings kind of has an impact on her in a way that he couldn't have foreseen, and so she breaks up with him. That's basically the plot, and then there's this subplot where Constantine is screwing over the Archangel Gabriel. I don't understand any of that. I don't know why he does this to Gabriel. Apparently, it's warranted, but we're not told why he does it. He's just like, if you have to ask, then you don't deserve to understand. I don't understand, but that's probably because I hadn't read the previous 50 or so issues of this run, or of this series. So if you've read everything leading up to this storyline, you might enjoy it quite a bit. But me, it was like jumping into the middle of an episode of a series and having no idea what was going on. The art is pretty good. The writing itself is pretty good. It's just, it doesn't hold my hand enough to let me know, okay, this is what's going on. And if you're a fan of the series Preacher, also by Ennis and Steve Dillon, then this trade paperback is kind of sort of a prologue to that series. It's not actually connected to the plot of Preacher, but it feels like these guys are kind of getting their footing. They're trying to figure out what they want to do, tonally speaking, when they get onto Preacher. This sort of feels like they're kind of trying to find what that series wants to be. And then lastly, we have Animal Man, The Last Days of Animal Man, rather, by Jerry Conway and Chris Batista and Dave Michas. And this was not very good. This has almost the exact opposite problem to the Meaning of Flesh, where it almost felt like it tried too hard to focus on the family drama, and it made it too heavy and too dark. This almost feels like it's trying too hard to focus on the superhero side of things. This is set in the year 2024. Animal Man is losing his powers, and basically, even though I said this is trying to focus on the superhero side of things, this introduces a couple of villains for Animal Man. It introduces Mirror Master's daughter, Prismatech is what she calls herself, and it introduces this other guy named Blood Rage. And it feels very Spider-Man-y. It feels like they're trying to introduce a rogues gallery for Animal Man. And the problem with that is Animal Man is not Spider-Man. He is not a character who has a weird and wacky rogues gallery. He's a guy who fights poachers who are killing whales out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and then he deals with mystical stuff that is impacting him, but he doesn't go out and fight costume supervillains. That's not really his thing, and so this felt really weird, like it was trying to make the series more superhero-y than what it had been known for, and I just don't feel like it worked very well. And also, neither of these supervillains, neither of them really felt like they were given a lot of personality. Prismatech is just crazy because, and she gives herself like 15 different motivations when she's doing her own little Freud thing in this book, and none of those explanations really fly. And then this other guy, he just wants the money. So neither of them feel like they're fleshed out or really characterized in any way that matters. And then outside of that, not really working for me, this whole book is basically just Animal Man going through a midlife crisis. And, you know, that's okay, but I feel like this whole book just didn't really feel like it had to be Animal Man. It almost feels like it could have been any other superhero set in the future. Or, for that matter, this didn't even have to be set in the future. This could have been set just a few weeks after the ending of 52, where Animal Man, for some reason, his powers are kind of going wonky, and then he's having trouble connecting with his family after he was exiled in space for a year. That could have been a story that they did. But instead, they set it in the future, and the ending does feel like something that had to be set outside of DC continuity. But I just don't feel like this story worked very well. It doesn't feel very Animal Man. It feels like it could have almost been any superhero, any C-list superhero anyway. And it just felt like Jerry Conway or Gary Conway was trying to do things with Animal Man that don't really work with the character of Animal Man. He's trying to add supervillains to his roster, and that's just not really something that works with Animal Man, in my opinion. So that's all the books that I read for this week, and let's look at the scoreboard real quick. I read 6 books, and I only added 1 book to the pile, Batman Chronicles Volume 1. You can do the math there. I don't remember how many that is since I started doing these weekly challenges for myself, but that is a book that I actually ordered before I filmed episode 1 of Adventures in Speed Reading, and then I just, it didn't arrive before that video, but then it arrived before this video. So that is the only book that has been added to the pile since the previous video. And so I'm not really sure what I'll be reading for next week. And let me know, guys, if you think that I should do these in smaller chunks. It would probably be a little bit more work for me to do them in smaller chunks, but at the same time, it would probably be easier for me to talk about each book in a little bit more detail than trying to talk about 6 books in one video. So let me know if you want me to do them in smaller chunks or keep doing them once a week like I have been doing. And so I will be seeing you guys throughout the rest of this week with some other videos, and I will catch you guys later. Have a great rest of the day. Peace out.